You just threw the owner of this hospital out like she was nothing." The words had not been spoken yet, but they were already hanging in the air, waiting to shatter everything. The automatic doors of St. Matthew Regional Medical Center slid open and closed in a constant rhythm, letting in the humid late summer air of Richmond, Virginia, but inside the emergency room, the atmosphere was cold, sharp, and unforgiving. Monitors beeped in uneven patterns. Nurses moved quickly between beds, and the scent of antiseptic lingered like a warning that this was a place where seconds decided everything. In the middle of it all stood Naomi Carter, her dark coat slightly damp from the drizzle outside, her eyes fixed on the double doors leading deeper into the emergency unit. Her breathing was steady, but her hands were clenched just enough to betray urgency. Somewhere beyond those doors, someone was fighting for their life, and she had come too far to be stopped now. Then the voice came, cutting through the noise like a blade. Officer Ryan Cole stepped forward, his hand already raised in a gesture that was more command than question. He was tall, broad, his uniform pressed perfectly, his badge catching the harsh fluorescent light. "You cannot go any further," he said, his tone flat, final. Naomi did not move. She met his eyes, calm, unshaken. "There is someone inside who needs me," she replied, her voice controlled, almost too controlled for the chaos around them. Ryan let out a short breath, one that carried more judgment than patience. His gaze swept over her, taking in her simple clothes, her lack of visible credentials, and something in his expression hardened. "You people always say that," he muttered, loud enough for nearby staff and patients to hear. A few heads turned. A nurse paused. The air shifted. Naomi felt it, the weight of those words, but she did not react. Not yet. Instead, she took a single step forward. That was when his hand shot out, stopping her cold. "I said no," he snapped, his voice rising now, drawing more attention. "If you do not have clearance, you're not going in there. That is how this works. Imagine standing there, knowing every second mattered, knowing someone's life was slipping away just feet from you, and being told you did not belong." Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Naomi slowly lowered her gaze for a brief moment, not in submission, but as if weighing something deeper than the situation in front of her. When she looked back up, there was something different in her eyes. Not fear, not anger, something quieter, something dangerous. "Then call the chief doctor," she said softly. Ryan scoffed immediately, shaking his head as if he had heard the same line 100 times before. "The chief doctor does not come down here for people like you," he replied, his voice dripping with dismissal. Behind him, the emergency room doors swung open for a split second as a gurney rushed through, giving Naomi a fleeting glimpse inside. Machines, movement, urgency, and then they shut again. The moment was gone. Ryan stepped closer, lowering his voice but tightening his grip on authority. "You are done here," he said. "Turn around and walk out before I make you." Around them, phones began to lift subtly. People were watching now, waiting. Naomi did not move. She simply stood there, her eyes locked on his, as if she already knew something he did not. And somewhere deep inside that hospital, footsteps had just begun to move faster. The tension did not break when Naomi Carter refused to move. It thickened. It settled into the air like something heavy and unseen, pressing down on every person within 10 feet of her. Officer Ryan Cole took one slow step closer, his boots striking the polished hospital floor with a sharp echo that seemed louder than it should have been. His jaw tightened as he looked at her, not just with authority now, but with something more personal, something colder. "I gave you a clear instruction," he said, each word measured, controlled, but edged with rising impatience. "You are interfering with emergency operations." Naomi did not step back. Her coat still clung slightly to her shoulders from the rain outside, a quiet reminder that she had come here through something, not just from somewhere. "And you are delaying them," she replied, her voice calm, steady, almost quiet enough to be missed if the room had not gone so still. A murmur moved through the small crowd that had formed. It was subtle, almost like a shift in breathing, but it was enough. Ryan noticed it. His eyes flicked briefly toward the onlookers, then back to Naomi, and whatever restraint he had been holding began to slip. "You think you can walk in here and tell me how to do my job?" he said, louder now, his voice carrying across the waiting area. "You do not even have clearance to be past that line." He pointed sharply toward the double doors, as if drawing an invisible boundary that she had already crossed in his mind. Naomi followed his gesture for a brief second, her gaze resting on the doors again. Somewhere beyond them, a machine alarm sounded, sharp and urgent, then cut off abruptly. Her fingers tightened slightly at her side. It was the only sign. "Every second matters," she said, her voice lower now, but somehow more intense. "You are standing in the way of that." Ryan let out a short, humorless laugh. "No," he replied, shaking his head. "What I'm standing in the way of is someone who does not belong here trying to push their way into a restricted area." The word belong lingered in the air, heavier than anything else he had said. Naomi's eyes met his again, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something deeper behind them. Not anger, not fear, recognition, as if she had heard that word before, in rooms just like this from voices just like his. But she did not react. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply stood there, her silence stretching just long enough to make the moment uncomfortable. Behind Ryan, Nurse Lily Grant shifted her weight, her eyes moving between them. There was hesitation in her expression now, something uncertain. She had seen confrontations before. The emergency room was not a place free from conflict. But this felt different. The woman standing in front of the officer did not look like someone causing trouble. She looked like someone waiting for something inevitable. "Officer Cole," Lily said carefully, stepping a little closer, her voice soft but clear. "Maybe we should just check if she is supposed to be here." Ryan did not turn around. "She is not," he said immediately, cutting her off. "If she was, she would have credentials, a badge, something." His eyes remained locked on Naomi as he spoke, as if daring her to produce proof that would justify her presence. Naomi tilted her head slightly, almost thoughtfully, as if considering his words. Then she spoke again, just as calm as before. "You are looking for something visible," she said. "That is the problem." Ryan's expression hardened. "No," he replied. "The problem is you are still standing here." He reached for his radio, his movements deliberate now, final. "Security to emergency in trance," he said into it, his voice clipped and official. "I need assistance removing an individual who is refusing to comply." The words removal and individual echoed through the space, stripping Naomi of identity, reducing her to a situation that needed to be handled. A few more phones lifted in the background. The tension was no longer quiet. It was building. Naomi glanced briefly toward the glass doors that led outside, then back to Ryan. For a moment, it almost looked like she might turn and leave. Like this was the point where the story ended the way it always did. But she did not move. Instead, she took a slow breath, steadying herself, her eyes returning to his with a calm that felt almost out of place in the rising storm around them. "You should not do that," she said softly. Ryan frowned slightly. "Do what?" Naomi held his gaze, unshaken. "Make a decision you cannot take back." For a split second, something shifted. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there, and Ryan felt it, even if he did not understand it. His grip tightened on the radio. "Too late for that," he said. Somewhere down the hallway, footsteps began to approach, fast, urgent, and growing louder with every passing second. The footsteps grew louder with each passing second, echoing through the long, sterile hallway like a warning that something was about to shift. Naomi Carter did not turn to look. She did not need to. The sound alone told her everything she needed to know. Around her, the energy in the emergency room tightened, as if the entire space was holding its breath. Officer Ryan Cole straightened slightly, his shoulders squaring as he prepared for backup, his confidence returning in visible waves. Reinforcement meant control. Control meant he was right. That was how it had always worked. "Good," he muttered under his breath, lowering the radio from his mouth. This ends now. But Naomi remained still, her posture unchanged, her eyes steady on his, as if the approaching presence behind him did not matter. And that was what made it different. Most people shifted when authority doubled. Most people stepped back when numbers increased. She did neither. She simply stood there, grounded, as if the floor beneath her belonged to her in a way no one else could understand. The doors to the inner emergency unit burst open again, not with the quiet urgency of a passing gurney this time, but with something sharper. A young resident rushed through, his scrubs slightly wrinkled, his expression tight with stress. "We need the attending now," he called out, not directed at anyone specific, just into the space itself. "Vitals are dropping fast." The words hit the room like a pulse of electricity. Nurse Lily Grant turned immediately, her instincts pulling her toward the crisis, but her eyes flicked once more toward Naomi before she moved. There was something unresolved there, something her training could not explain. Ryan barely reacted to the announcement. His focus never left Naomi. "Not your problem," he said coldly, as if dismissing both her and the urgency behind those doors in the same breath. Naomi's gaze shifted for just a fraction of a second toward the resident, toward the doors, toward the life hanging somewhere in that space. And then back to Ryan. "You are wrong," she said quietly. "It is exactly my problem." The resident hesitated, glancing between them, confusion flickering across his face, but the moment passed quickly as he rushed deeper into the department again. The doors swung shut behind him, sealing the urgency back inside. The sound of his fading footsteps blended with the steady beeping of machines, a reminder that time was still moving, whether they were ready or not. Ryan exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. "You are done talking," he said, stepping forward again, closing what little distance remained between them. "Security is on the way. You can either walk out on your own, or we can make this more difficult than it needs to be." Naomi looked at him, really looked at him now, as if measuring something beyond his words, beyond his badge, beyond the authority he carried so confidently. "You think this is about difficulty," she said, her voice calm, but carrying a quiet weight that did not match the chaos around them. "It is about consequence." The word lingered, subtle but heavy. Behind Ryan, the automatic doors near the entrance slid open again, and two hospital security officers stepped inside, their uniforms darker, their expressions already set in expectation of a problem. They moved quickly, scanning the scene, their attention locking on to Naomi almost immediately. Ryan gestured toward her without turning his head. "She is refusing to leave," he said. "Remove her." The officers exchanged a brief glance, then stepped forward. One of them, a tall man with a calm but firm presence, approached Naomi carefully. "Ma'am," he said, his tone more measured than Ryan's, but still authoritative. "We're going to need you to come with us." Naomi did not respond right away. Her eyes shifted briefly past them, toward the hallway where the urgent footsteps had come from. Then back again. "No," she said simply. The word was not loud. It was not aggressive, but it carried a finality that made both officers hesitate for just a fraction of a second. Ryan's jaw tightened again. "You heard her," he snapped. "She is not cooperating." The taller officer stepped closer, his hand lifting slightly, not yet touching, but close enough to signal what would come next. The room seemed to narrow around that single moment. Phones were no longer subtle now. People were watching openly, waiting. Naomi's gaze did not move from Ryan. "This is your last chance," she said softly. "Do not make this worse." Ryan let out a short, sharp breath, shaking his head as if dismissing her entirely. "You do not get to give me chances," he replied. And with that, he gave a small nod to the officers. The moment hung for a split second longer, stretched thin between action and restraint. And then, just as the officer's hand moved forward, a voice cut through the entire room from down the hallway, sharp, commanding, and unmistakably urgent. "Where is Dr. Carter right now?" Everything stopped. The words hit the room like a sudden drop in pressure. "Where is Dr. Carter right now?" The voice came from deep in the hallway, sharp, controlled, and carrying the kind of authority that did not need to be repeated. Every movement in the emergency room stalled. The security officer's hand froze inches from Naomi Carter's arm. Nurse Lily Grant turned fully toward the sound, her eyes widening as recognition set in. Even Officer Ryan Cole hesitated just for a fraction of a second, his grip on the situation slipping in a way he did not yet understand. The hallway that had been filled with urgency moments before now carried something else, something heavier. Footsteps followed the voice, fast but deliberate, each one echoing with purpose as they approached. A man stepped into view, his white coat moving with him, his expression tight with focus. Dr. Ethan Brooks, the chief doctor of St. Matthew Regional Medical Center. His presence alone shifted the air. Conversations died. Movement slowed. People straightened without realizing it. This was not just another doctor. This was the one people listened to. His eyes scanned the room quickly, taking in the tension, the raised phones, the halted confrontation. "I asked a question," he said, his voice lower now, but no less commanding. "Where is Dr. Carter?" The words landed differently this time. Not just a name, a position, a role, something official. Nurse Lily stepped forward instinctively. "We have not seen Dr. Carter come through," she said carefully, her voice respectful, but uncertain. "We have a critical patient inside, and we have been trying to locate." Her words trailed off as Dr. Brooks' gaze shifted past her, past the security officers, past Ryan, and landed directly on Naomi. The moment stretched. It was subtle, almost invisible, but something in his expression changed. Not surprise, not confusion, recognition, clear and immediate. Naomi did not move. She did not speak. She simply met his eyes the same way she had met Ryan's, calm, steady, unshaken. Around them, people began to notice. The way Dr. Brooks had stopped mid-step. The way his focus had locked onto her and nothing else. Ryan followed that gaze, his brow tightening slightly as he turned just enough to glance back at Naomi, as if seeing her again for the first time. "Sir," Ryan said, stepping in slightly, his voice regaining some of its authority. "This individual is refusing to leave a restricted area. We were in the process of stop." The word was quiet. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Ryan's sentence cut off instantly, like a switch had been flipped. Dr. Brooks did not look at him. Not yet. His attention remained on Naomi. And then, in a gesture so small it almost went unnoticed, he adjusted his posture, straightening slightly, his expression shifting from urgency to something more controlled. "Respect, ma'am," he said, his voice steady, carrying across the room with a weight that silenced even the whispers. "I apologize for the delay." The word ma'am landed like a shockwave. It moved through the room in silence, but its impact was immediate. Nurse Lily's eyes widened. The security officers exchanged a quick glance. Phones lowered slightly, as if people needed both hands to process what they had just heard. And Ryan stood completely still. For a brief moment, it did not register. The word did not fit the narrative he had already built in his mind. It did not align with the assumptions he had made the second he saw her. But reality was not asking for his permission anymore. Naomi inclined her head slightly, acknowledging Dr. Brooks without any visible surprise. "There is no time to waste," she said calmly. "Vitals are dropping." Dr. Brooks nodded once, sharply, as if her words confirmed something he already knew. "Understood," he replied. Then, finally, his gaze shifted. It landed on Ryan, and everything about his expression changed. The respect was gone. In its place was something colder, controlled, but unmistakable. "Officer," he said, his tone even but firm. "Step aside." The words were simple, direct, but they carried a weight that pressed down on the entire situation. Ryan opened his mouth, as if to respond, to reclaim control, to explain. But no words came out, because in that moment, something inside him had begun to fracture. The version of the situation he had been so certain of was no longer holding together, and everyone around him could see it. The room had shifted, the power had shifted, and he was no longer standing where he thought he was. For a moment, no one moved. The air itself seemed to hesitate, caught between what had just happened and what it meant. Officer Ryan Cole stood frozen, his hand still slightly raised from the command he had given only seconds ago, but now it looked misplaced, almost out of place, like a gesture that no longer belonged to him. The authority he had carried so confidently moments before had begun to slip, not all at once, but enough for everyone to feel it. Naomi Carter did not rush forward. She did not react with urgency, even though everything about the situation demanded it. Instead, she took one measured step, then another, moving, past the security officers who instinctively stepped aside without being told. It was not obedience to her words. It was something else, recognition, even if they could not yet explain why. As she passed Ryan, she did not look at him immediately. The distance between them closed in silence, but it was a silence that carried weight, heavy with everything that had just unfolded. Then, just as she moved beside him, she turned her head slightly, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You said I did not belong here," she said calmly. "Now watch carefully." The words were not loud. They were not threatening, but they settled deep, far deeper than anything he had said to her. Before Ryan could respond, before he could even fully process the shift that had taken place, Naomi continued forward, her pace steady as she approached the double doors. Dr. Ethan Brooks moved with her, falling into step beside her without hesitation, his earlier urgency now aligned with hers. "The patient is in trauma room 2, he said quickly, his tone focused, professional, but still carrying that unmistakable respect. "We have internal bleeding and unstable pressure. We have been waiting for you." Naomi nodded once, her expression sharpening, the calm giving way to precision. "How long?" she asked. "Approximately 8 minutes since the last drop," Dr. Brooks replied. Naomi did not slow. "That is already too long," she said. The doors opened, and she stepped through without breaking stride. Inside, the world shifted instantly. The waiting room tension was replaced by controlled chaos. Monitors beeped in rapid succession. Nurses moved quickly, voices overlapping in urgent coordination. A patient lay on the bed, pale, motionless except for the faint rise and fall of their chest. Machines tracked every second that mattered. Naomi stepped into that space as if she had always been there. "No hesitation, no uncertainty." "Report," she said, her voice firm now, carrying across the room with quiet authority. A nurse responded immediately, listing vitals, medications, everything that had been done so far. Naomi listened, her eyes already scanning the patient, taking in details faster than anyone else in the room could follow. "Prepare for immediate intervention," she said, her tone decisive. "We are not waiting any longer." Outside, the doors swung shut again, sealing the moment inside, and leaving Ryan Cole standing on the other side. The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was heavy, different. People were no longer watching Naomi. They were watching him. The phones that had been raised earlier were still there, but now they were focused on something else entirely. The shift in power had become visible, tangible. Ryan swallowed, his throat suddenly dry, his mind racing to catch up with what he had just witnessed. The pieces did not fit together. The woman he had just tried to remove from the building was now inside, leading the very emergency he had claimed she had no place in. He turned slightly toward Dr. Brooks, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty. "What is going on?" he asked. Dr. Brooks did not answer immediately. His gaze remained on the doors for a moment longer, as if making sure everything inside was moving as it should. Then he looked at Ryan, and there was no softness in his expression this time. "You interfered with a critical situation," he said evenly. "That is what is going on." Ryan opened his mouth, ready to defend himself, to explain the protocol, the restrictions, the authority he had been following. But the words felt different now, weaker, less certain. "I was doing my job," he said, though even to his own ears it sounded less convincing than it had before. Dr. Brooks held his gaze, unblinking. "No," he replied. "You were making assumptions." The words landed harder than any accusation. Around them, the room had not returned to normal. It had shifted into something else entirely, something that had not finished unfolding yet. And somewhere behind those closed doors, The truth about Naomi Carter was only just beginning to reveal itself. Inside Trauma Room 2, time no longer moved in seconds. It fractured into moments. Sharp, precise, unforgiving moments that demanded absolute control. Naomi Carter stood at the center of it, her presence cutting through the chaos not by force, but by certainty. "Clamp here," she said, her voice steady, guiding a nurse's hands without hesitation. "We are losing too much volume." The monitor beside the bed let out a sharp warning tone, the line dipping dangerously before rising again. The patient's skin had taken on a pale, almost gray tone, the kind that made every trained instinct in the room tighten at once. Dr. Ethan Brooks stood just behind Naomi's shoulder, watching closely, following her. Led without question. "Pressure is unstable," he reported. "We are not holding." Naomi did not look up. Her focus remained fixed, her movements controlled, deliberate. "We will," she replied. "We are not done yet." There was no panic in her voice. No hesitation, only direction. Around her, the team adjusted instantly, responding not to the situation, but to her. That was the difference. Outside the doors, Officer Ryan Cole remained where he was, but he was no longer standing in control. He was standing in uncertainty. The muffled sounds from inside the trauma room reached him in fragments. Orders. Movement. The steady rhythm of a battle being fought just out of sight. And with every passing second, the reality of what he had done pressed heavier against him. Nurse Lily Grant stepped closer to the doors, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes fixed on the narrow window as she tried to follow what was happening inside. "She stepped in like she has done this 1,000 times, she said quietly, almost to herself. Ryan turned slightly toward her, his brow still furrowed. "Who is she?" he asked, the question coming out more uncertain than he intended. Lily hesitated, then shook her head slightly. "I do not know everything," she admitted, "but I know enough to understand that you should not have stopped her." The words landed, not as an accusation, but as a fact. And facts were harder to push away. Ryan looked back toward the doors, his jaw tightening again, but this time it was not out of control. It was out of realization. Inside, Naomi's voice cut through the rising tension again. "We need to move now," she said. "Prep for immediate intervention. No dilas." A nurse nodded quickly, moving to follow instructions, while another adjusted the equipment at the bedside. The room moved as one, not because they were told to, but because they trusted the direction being given. That trust had not appeared out of nowhere. It had been earned long before this moment. Naomi leaned slightly closer to the patient, her eyes scanning, calculating, adjusting. Every detail mattered. Every second counted. "Stay with me," she said quietly, not to the room, but to the person on the table. It was not dramatic. It was not loud, but it carried weight. Outside, Ryan shifted his stance, his earlier confidence now replaced by something far more uncomfortable. He replayed the last few minutes in his mind, each moment sharper now than it had been when it happened. The words he had used, the assumptions he had made, the way he had looked at her and decided who she was without knowing anything at all. Dr. Brooks' earlier words echoed back. "You were making assumptions." Ryan exhaled slowly, running a hand along his jaw as if trying to ground himself in something that still made sense. But the situation no longer followed the logic he had relied on. It had changed, and he had not seen it coming. The security officers who had been called to remove Naomi now stood off to the side, their posture more relaxed, their attention no longer on enforcement, but on observation. One of them glanced briefly at Ryan, then looked away, as if choosing not to say what was already obvious. Inside the trauma room, the pace shifted again. The monitor steadied slightly, the warning tone fading into a more consistent rhythm. Not safe, not stable, but better. Naomi straightened just slightly, her shoulders easing by a fraction. "That is it," she said. "Hold it there." Dr. Brooks let out a controlled breath, nodding once. "We are stabilizing," he confirmed. Naomi finally looked up, her gaze moving across the team, making sure every piece was where it needed to be. "Do not relax yet," she said. "We are not finished." Her voice was firm, But there was something else in it now. Not relief. Not yet. But certainty that they were moving in the right direction. Outside, Ryan stared at the closed doors, the weight of everything settling in fully for the first time. This was not just a mistake. It was something deeper, something that could not be undone by explanation or protocol. And as the sounds from inside began to shift from chaos to control, one truth became impossible to ignore. The woman he had tried to force out was the reason someone inside that room still had a chance to survive. Inside Trauma Room 2, the tension did not disappear when the monitor steadied. It changed. It deepened into something quieter, more focused, like a storm that had not passed but had shifted direction. Naomi Carter stood still for a brief second, her eyes fixed on the patient as the numbers stabilized just enough to give them a narrow window. Not safety, not yet, but possibility. "We hold here," she said, her voice low but firm, cutting through the controlled urgency of the room. "Nos sabemos." We maintain pressure and monitor every fluctuation. The team responded instantly, their movements more precise now, less frantic, guided by her presence rather than driven by fear. Dr. Ethan Brooks stepped closer, reviewing the monitor, then glancing at Naomi. "We were minutes away from losing them," he said quietly. Naomi did not look at him right away. Her gaze remained on the patient, watching, calculating, listening to the rhythm of the machines as if they were speaking directly to her. "Minutes matter," she replied, "and so do decisions." The words carried more than just medical meaning. They hung in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Around them, the room seemed to settle into a new rhythm. The sharp edge of panic had been replaced by discipline. A nurse adjusted the intravenous line. Another checked the readings again, double confirming every number. No one questioned Naomi's direction. No one hesitated. Outside the doors, Officer Ryan Cole remained rooted in place, but the stillness inside the trauma room had begun to affect him too. The sounds coming through the wall had changed. They were no longer chaotic. They were controlled, and that control did not come from him. It never had. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering slightly as the weight of that realization pressed deeper. He glanced at the small window again, catching a brief glimpse of Naomi moving with calm precision inside. The same woman he had tried to remove minutes earlier now stood at the center of everything that mattered. Nurse Lily Grant stood beside him now, her gaze fixed on the same window, her expression thoughtful, almost distant. "Do you hear that?" she asked quietly. Ryan frowned slightly. "Hear what?" Lily did not look at him. "The silence," she said, "not the absence of noise. The control. That only happens when the right person is in charge." Ryan swallowed, his throat tightening again. He wanted to respond, to argue, to reclaim something of what he had lost. But the words did not come, because deep down, he knew she was right. Inside, Naomi finally stepped back half a pace, allowing another doctor to take over a specific task while she observed the bigger picture. Her hands lowered, slightly, but her focus did not shift. "We are not finished," she said again, reinforcing it, making sure no one relaxed too soon. Dr. Brooks nodded in agreement. "We will keep monitoring closely," he said, "but we are moving in the right direction." Naomi's gaze softened just slightly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. Then, for the first time since she had entered the room, she allowed herself a brief pause. A single breath. It was small, almost invisible, but it marked something important. Not the end, but the turning point. She looked once more at the patient, then at the team around her, confirming that everything was stable enough for her to step away, even if only for a moment. "Maintain current protocol," she instructed. "I will be right outside." No one questioned it. No one hesitated. She turned toward the doors, her movements as controlled as ever, and walked out. The doors opened, and the noise of the waiting area returned, but it felt different now. Quieter. Heavier. The moment Naomi stepped back into the space, every eye shifted to her. Conversation stopped. Phones lowered slightly. Even the air seemed to change again, adjusting to her presence. Ryan stood exactly where he had been, but now there was no barrier between them. No authority separating them. Just distance. And the weight of everything that had already happened. Naomi looked at him, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something far more unsettling. Clarity. She took a few steps forward, stopping just within speaking distance. For a moment, she said nothing, and that silence carried more impact than anything else she could have said. Then calmly she spoke. "He is stable," she said. "For now." Ryan nodded slightly, almost automatically, as if responding to a superior without realizing it. Naomi watched him for a second longer, her expression unreadable. "You almost cost him his life," she added quietly. The words were not loud. They were not aggressive, but they landed harder than anything else that had been said that day. Around them, no one moved. No one spoke, because in that moment, the truth was no longer hidden. It was standing right there, in front of everyone, and there was no way to ignore it anymore. The words did not fade after Naomi Carter spoke them. They lingered in the air, heavier than anything that had come before. "You almost cost him his life." There was no raised voice, no anger, just truth. And truth had a way of cutting deeper than any accusation. Officer Ryan Cole stood there, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but caught somewhere in between defense and disbelief. His mind searched for something to hold on to, something that could justify what he had done, something that could restore the structure he had relied on. "I was following protocol," he said finally, his voice lower now, less certain, as if even he could hear the weakness in it. Naomi did not respond immediately. She studied him for a brief moment, not with judgment, but with clarity. "Protocol does not replace judgment," she said calmly, "and it does not excuse it either." Around them, the silence deepened. The people who had been watching earlier were no longer just observing a confrontation. They were witnessing a shift. The phones that had been raised were still recording, but now the focus was not on conflict. It was on consequence. Ryan's jaw tightened slightly, his instinct to push back still there, still fighting to regain control. "You walked in without identification," he said, trying to rebuild his argument piece by piece. "You refused to comply. You crossed a restricted line." Naomi nodded once, acknowledging each point without interrupting. "And you decided what that meant before you asked a single question," she replied. The words landed cleanly, directly. There was no space to twist them, no angle to deflect them. Ryan opened his mouth again, but stopped, because for the first time, he could not find a response that did not collapse under its own weight. Behind Naomi, the emergency room doors opened briefly as a nurse stepped out, speaking quietly to another staff member about updated vitals. The tone was calmer now, controlled. The difference between chaos and stability had already been established, and everyone knew who had made that difference. Dr. Ethan Brooks stepped forward slightly, his presence reinforcing what had already been made clear. "Officer Cole," he said, his voice even but firm, "this situation is under hospital authority now. You will stand down." Ryan looked at him, then back at Naomi, the reality of the shift settling deeper with each passing second. This was no longer a situation he could manage. It had moved beyond him. The structure he had relied on was no longer supporting him. It was exposing him. Naomi turned slightly, her gaze moving across the room, taking in the faces, the tension, the quiet realization spreading through the space. Then she looked back at Ryan. "You saw what you expected to see," she said, "not what was actually in front of you." Ryan exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to show the change. The fight was still there, but it was no longer leading. It was reacting. "I did my job," he repeated, but this time it sounded less like a statement and more like a question. Naomi stepped closer, closing the distance between them just enough to remove any illusion of separation. "No," she said quietly. "You did what was easy." The words settled into him, deeper than anything else she had said, because somewhere inside, he recognized the truth in them. The room remained still, but it was no longer tense in the same way. It had shifted into something heavier, something reflective, the kind of silence that follows realization. One of the security officers shifted slightly to the side, creating more space around Naomi without being told. It was subtle, but it mattered. Respect did not need to be announced. It revealed itself. Naomi glanced briefly toward the emergency doors again, confirming that everything inside remained stable. Then she turned back to Ryan one last time. Next time, she said, her voice calm but unwavering, ask before you decide who belongs. There was no threat in her tone, no demand, just a statement, a boundary. And then she stepped past him, not as someone forcing her way through, but as someone who had already proven she did not need to. Ryan did not stop her. He did not speak. He simply stood there, the weight of everything pressing down in a way that no badge, no authority, no protocol could shield him from anymore. And as the room slowly began to move again, one truth remained clear to everyone who had witnessed it. Power was not what he thought it was, and neither was control. Naomi Carter did not look back as she moved away from Officer Ryan Cole, but the weight of what had just happened followed her through every step. The emergency room had not returned to normal. It had shifted into something quieter, more aware, as if everyone present had witnessed a line being drawn and then erased in real time. Conversations resumed, but softer. Movements continued, but more deliberate. And in the center of it all, the echo of that moment remained. Ryan stood where she had left him, his thoughts no longer racing but circling, replaying each second with painful clarity. The words she had spoken did not leave him. You did what was easy. Ask before you decide who belongs. They repeated in his mind, not as accusations anymore, but as truths he could not avoid. He glanced down briefly at his own hands, the same hands that had blocked her path, that had reached for control without question. Now, they felt different, heavier, uncertain. Officer Cole. The voice came from behind him, steady, professional. Ryan turned to see a hospital administrator approaching, a woman in a tailored suit with a badge clipped neatly at her side. Her expression was calm, but there was no warmth in it. We need to speak with you, she said. Ryan straightened slightly, instinct returning, but it did not carry the same weight it had before. About what? He asked, though part of him already knew the answer. The administrator held his gaze. About what just happened, she replied. Around them, a few of the onlookers shifted subtly, attention turning again. The moment was not over. It was evolving. Ryan nodded once, his jaw tightening again, but this time not out of defiance, out of anticipation. All right, he said. The administrator gestured toward a quieter area near the corridor, away from the main flow of patients and staff. As Ryan followed, he became aware of the subtle distance that had formed around him. People were no longer simply watching. They were assessing. Inside Trauma Room 2, Naomi had returned to the patient's side briefly, confirming stability before stepping back again. The numbers held. Not perfect, but holding. She allowed herself another measured breath, then turned to Dr. Ethan Brooks. Continue monitoring closely, she said. If anything shifts, I want to know immediately. Dr. Brooks nodded. Of course, he replied. And thank you. Naomi met his gaze for a moment, then gave a slight nod. Focus on the patient, she said simply. Gratitude was not what mattered right now. Outcome was. She stepped out of the room once more, the doors closing behind her with a soft but final sound. This time, the atmosphere in the emergency area did not tense when she appeared. It adjusted. Nurses moved aside without being asked. Conversations lowered slightly. Respect did not need to be declared. It had already settled into place. Across the room, Ryan stood with the administrator, their conversation quiet but serious. Naomi did not approach immediately. Instead, she observed for a moment, her gaze steady, taking the scene not as someone reacting, but as someone evaluating. The administrator spoke calmly, but her posture was firm. Ryan listened, his responses minimal, his earlier confidence replaced by something more restrained. The shift was complete. Naomi walked forward at a measured pace, not interrupting, not asserting, simply entering the space with quiet authority. The administrator noticed her first and paused, turning slightly. Dr. Carter, she said, her tone respectful. Ryan turned as well, his expression tightening slightly as their eyes met again. There was no anger in Naomi's gaze. No triumph, only clarity. Is everything stable? The administrator asked. Naomi nodded once. For now, she replied, but it should not have come that close. The administrator's expression hardened just slightly at that. She glanced at Ryan, then back at Naomi. "We will address that," she said. Naomi held her gaze for a brief moment, then spoke again, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that extended beyond the immediate situation. "This is not just about one moment," she said. "It is about a pattern." Ryan's breath caught slightly at that. Not because the words were loud, but because of what they implied. Naomi turned her attention to him directly now. Not confrontational, but direct. "Today you made a decision based on what you assumed," she said. "Next time it might not be someone who can step past it." The words settled into the space between them, heavier than anything before. Around them, the hospital continued to move, but the center of attention had shifted again. Not to conflict, not to control, but to consequence. And as Naomi stepped back slightly, allowing the administrator to continue the conversation, one truth became clear to everyone who had witnessed it. This was no longer about who had authority in the moment. It was about who understood the weight of it, and who did not. The hallway conversation did not end when Naomi Carter stepped back. It deepened. The hospital administrator turned fully toward Officer Ryan Cole, her posture firm, her expression no longer neutral. "We are going to document everything that happened here," she said, her tone calm, but carrying unmistakable authority. "From the moment you entered this facility to the moment Dr. Carter was allowed through those doors." Ryan nodded slowly, his earlier resistance no longer visible, replaced by something heavier, something more controlled. "I understand," he replied, though the words felt different now, stripped of confidence and filled with consequence. Naomi stood a few feet away, not inserting herself into the process, but not leaving either. Her presence alone anchored the moment, a quiet reminder that this was not just a procedural discussion. It was the result of a decision that had already had real impact. The administrator glanced briefly toward her, then back to Ryan. "You will also need to provide a full report to your department," she continued. "This situation involved interference with emergency medical care." The phrase hung in the air, formal and precise, but carrying weight far beyond its structure. Ryan swallowed, his throat tightening again. "Yes, ma'am," he said. The word came out differently this time. Softer, not automatic. Chosen. Naomi noticed, but did not react outwardly. Instead, she turned her gaze slightly, scanning the room once more, confirming that the environment had returned to controlled movement. Staff were working. Patients were being attended to. Life inside the hospital continued, but the awareness of what had just occurred had not faded. Dr. Ethan Brooks stepped forward again, joining the conversation, his presence reinforcing the gravity of the situation. "This was not a minor disruption," he said, his voice steady. "We were dealing with a critical case. Every second mattered." Ryan nodded again, more firmly this time, not in defense, but in acknowledgement. "I understand that now," he said. Dr. Brooks held his gaze for a moment longer, then spoke again, quieter but more direct. "Understanding it now does not change what happened." The words settled in fully. There was no argument left, no angle to push back from, only the reality of the moment and what it had revealed. Naomi stepped forward then, closing the distance slightly, not to confront, but to finalize what had already been made clear. "What matters is what happens after this," she said calmly. Ryan looked at her, his expression no longer guarded, no longer defensive, but searching. "What do you mean?" he asked quietly. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "You can treat this like an incident," she said, "or you can treat it like a lesson." The distinction was simple, but the meaning behind it was not. Around them, the hospital continued its rhythm, but the space they stood in felt separate, defined by the weight of that choice. Ryan exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly as the reality of what she was saying settled in. "And if I do not?" he asked, not challenging but honest. Naomi's expression did not change. "Then this will happen again," she replied, "just with someone who may not get a second chance." The words landed with quiet finality. There was no threat, no raised voice, just truth. The administrator stepped in again, her tone returning to formal structure. "Officer Cole, you are dismissed from this area," she said. "We will follow up with your department directly." Ryan nodded once more, this time without hesitation. Understood, he said. He turned slightly, preparing to leave, but paused for just a moment. Then he looked back at Naomi. Dr. Carter, he said, the title deliberate now, no longer uncertain. Naomi held his gaze, acknowledging it with a slight nod. No more words were needed. Ryan turned and walked away, his steps measured, no longer carrying the same force they had when he arrived. As he moved toward the exit, the space seemed to open around him, not in avoidance, but in quiet recognition of what had just unfolded. Naomi watched him go for a brief moment, then turned back toward the emergency room doors. The work was not finished. It never was. But something had changed. Not just in the room, not just in Ryan. Something deeper. And as she stepped forward again, returning to where she was needed most, one truth remained clear, steady, and undeniable. Authority could be worn, but respect had to be earned. And once it revealed itself, it could not be ignored. The emergency room did not pause for reflection, but something beneath its constant motion had changed. Naomi Carter stepped back through the double doors once more, returning to Trauma Room 2 with the same quiet authority she had carried before. But now there was no resistance, no hesitation, no questioning of her presence. The team adjusted instinctively as she re-entered, creating space without being asked, their focus aligning with. Here's the moment she stepped into view. The patient's condition had stabilized further, the monitor now holding a steady rhythm that no longer screamed urgency, but still demanded vigilance. Naomi moved closer, her eyes scanning the readings, her mind already processing what came next. Update, she said, her voice calm, controlled, grounded in certainty. A nurse responded immediately, listing the latest numbers, the medications administered, the response observed over the past few minutes. Naomi listened without interrupting, her gaze shifting between the monitor and the patient, confirming each detail with silent precision. Good, she said after a moment. We maintain this and prepare for the next phase. No shortcuts. Dr. Ethan Brooks stood beside her, nodding in agreement. We have regained stability, he said. We would not have reached this point without you. Naomi did not respond to the praise. Instead, she adjusted her focus back to the patient, her expression steady. We reached this point because the team did not stop, she said. That is what matters. The room settled into a controlled rhythm once again, each person moving with purpose, guided by direction that no longer needed to be questioned. Outside the room, the ripple of what had happened continued to spread through the hospital. Staff who had witnessed the confrontation earlier spoke in quieter tones now, their words carrying a different weight. Not gossip, not speculation, understanding. Nurse Lily Grant stood near the nurse's station, reviewing charts, but her attention drifted back toward the trauma room window. She had seen situations escalate before. She had seen authority clash with urgency, but she had never seen it resolve like this. Not with silence, not with clarity. Inside, Naomi stepped back slightly, allowing the team to carry forward the next steps while she observed the overall progression. Her presence remained central, even in stillness. That was the difference. Control did not always look like action. Sometimes it looked like knowing exactly when to step back. Dr. Brooks glanced at her again, his expression thoughtful. There's something I've been meaning to say. He began, his tone more personal now, less clinical. Naomi turned her head slightly, acknowledging him without shifting her focus entirely. This hospital, he continued, lowering his voice just enough to separate the moment from the surrounding activity, would not exist in its current form without your work. Most people here do not even realize that. Naomi's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in her gaze, something reflective, something deeper than the moment itself. They do not need to, she replied quietly. They just needed to work when it matters. The words carried a quiet philosophy, one that had guided her long before this moment, one that did not seek recognition, only impact. Dr. Brooks nodded slowly, understanding more than he had before. Outside the room, a staff member passed by, speaking softly into a phone about administrative follow-up, about reports that needed to be filed, about conversations that would continue long after the day ended. The system was already responding. Inside, the patient's condition continued to hold steady, the numbers stabilizing further, the immediate danger beginning to pass. Naomi allowed herself a brief moment to observe that change, to confirm it fully. Then she spoke again. "We will transfer to intensive monitoring once ready," she said. "No dilas, no assumptions." The word assumptions lingered, not directed at anyone in the room, but carrying meaning beyond it. The team acknowledged, adjusting accordingly. Everything moved forward. Everything aligned. And in that alignment, the earlier chaos felt distant, almost unreal, even though its impact remained. Naomi stepped back one final time, her role in this phase complete, her presence still anchoring the room even as she moved toward the door. As she exited, the controlled rhythm inside continued without disruption, a clear sign that what she had set in motion would hold. Outside, the hospital carried on, but the awareness of what had unfolded remained embedded in every interaction, every glance, every quiet conversation. And as Naomi walked down the hallway, her steps steady, her expression unchanged, one truth followed her, unspoken but undeniable. The difference between power and responsibility had been made clear. And once seen, it could not be unseen. The hospital had returned to motion, but not to normal. Something had settled beneath the surface, something that would not disappear once the day ended. Reports were already being filed. Conversations had moved beyond the emergency room and into offices, into systems that did not rely on emotion, only on facts. Naomi Carter stood near the observation window of the intensive care unit, her eyes resting on the patient who had been transferred moments earlier. The machines were steady now, their rhythm controlled, their warning tones replaced by quiet consistency. It was not victory, not yet, but it was a chance. And sometimes a chance was everything. Behind her, the sound of approaching footsteps was measured, deliberate. She did not turn immediately. She already knew who it was. "Dr. Carter," the hospital administrator said as she came to a stop beside her. Her tone was respectful, but there was a new layer beneath it now. Formal acknowledgement. "We have completed the initial review of the incident." Naomi nodded slightly, her gaze still on the patient. And she said calmly. The administrator took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "The officer involved has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation," she said. "His department has been notified, and the footage recorded by witnesses has already been submitted as part of the report." Naomi's expression did not change. There was no satisfaction in her face, no visible reaction at all, just stillness. "That is appropriate," she replied quietly. The administrator studied her for a moment, as if expecting something more. "Most people would have a stronger reaction," she said. Naomi finally turned, meeting her gaze directly. "This is not about reaction," she said. "It is about accountability." The word carried weight. Not anger, not revenge, something more grounded, more permanent. The administrator nodded slowly, understanding, settling in deeper. "There will be further consequences," she added. "This will not end here." Naomi held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. "It should not," she said. Down the hallway, Nurse Lily Grant stood near the nurse's station, speaking quietly with another staff member, but her attention drifted again toward Naomi. She had heard enough of the conversation to understand what was unfolding. Not just the outcome, the meaning behind it. This was not about one officer. It was about something larger. Something that had been present long before today. Naomi turned back toward the observation window, her focus returning to the patient. The steady rise and fall of their chest. The quiet hum of the machines. Life continuing, fragile but real. "They will recover," she said softly, almost to herself. The administrator followed her gaze. "Because of you," she replied. Naomi shook her head slightly. "Because someone stepped in when it mattered," she said. "That is all." The distinction was subtle, but it mattered. Responsibility was not ownership. It was action. Down the corridor, a group of staff passed by, their voices low, their movements purposeful. The hospital continued to function, but the awareness of what had happened remained embedded in every interaction. A lesson had been witnessed, not taught through words, through consequence. The administrator stepped back slightly, giving Naomi space. "If you need anything further," she said, "we will ensure it is handled." Naomi nodded once. "Make sure it is not forgotten," she replied. The administrator held her gaze, then nodded in return. "It will not be." She turned and walked away, her steps steady, her role in the moment complete. Naomi remained where she was, her reflection faintly visible in the glass as she watched over the patient. For a moment, the noise of the hospital faded into the background. There was no confrontation here, no raised voices, only the quiet aftermath of a decision that had almost gone too far, and the reality of what had been revealed because of it. After a few seconds, Naomi stepped away from the window, her movements calm, her expression unchanged. She did not linger. She did not look back. The work was done for now, but the impact would continue. As she walked down the hallway, passing staff who now stepped aside without hesitation, one truth followed her, steady and undeniable. Justice did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrived in silence. And when it did, it changed everything. The next morning, the hospital did not look any different from the outside. The same glass doors opened and closed. The same ambulances arrived and departed. The same rhythm of urgency and care continued as it always had. But inside, something had changed in a way that could not be seen, only felt. Naomi Carter walked through the main corridor with the same quiet presence she had carried the day before, her steps steady, her expression calm. Staff members greeted her as she passed, some with a nod, others with a simple glance that carried recognition without needing words. Respect had settled into the space she moved through, not forced, not demanded, but earned through what they had witnessed. Inside the intensive care unit, the patient lay resting, their condition no longer critical. The machines still monitored every detail, but the urgency had faded into careful observation. Dr. Ethan Brooks stood nearby, reviewing the latest chart when Naomi entered. He looked up and offered a small nod. "They are going to make it," he said. Naomi stepped closer, her eyes moving over the readings, confirming the stability for herself. "Good," she replied softly. There was no relief in her voice, only acknowledgement. "Because yesterday almost took that away." Dr. Brooks hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "The department contacted us this morning," he said. "Officer Ryan Cole has been officially suspended pending further review. There will be a formal inquiry." Naomi remained still, her gaze still on the patient. "That is the process," she said. Dr. Brooks studied her for a moment. "You are not surprised?" he said. Naomi shook her head slightly. "No," she replied, "but that is not what matters." She turned then, meeting his eyes directly. "What matters is whether anything changes after that." The words lingered between them, heavier than the outcome itself. Dr. Brooks nodded slowly, understanding the difference. Later that day, across town, Ryan Cole sat alone at a small table in a quiet room at his department. The uniform he had worn so confidently the day before was no longer on him. In its place was something simpler, something that did not carry authority. A file sat in front of him, thick with reports, statements, and recorded footage that he had already been asked to review. He had watched it more than once. Each time, it looked different, not because the events had changed, but because his understanding of them had. He saw the moment he stepped forward, the way he raised his hand, the words he chose, the assumptions he made before asking a single question. He saw Naomi standing there, calm, steady, unshaken. And he saw the moment everything shifted. The moment Dr. Brooks said, "Ma'am." Ryan leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly as he closed the file. The room was quiet, but not empty. It was filled with realization, not forced, not assigned, earned through reflection he could no longer avoid. Back at the hospital, Naomi stepped out of the intensive care unit and into the hallway once more. The day moved forward around her, staff continuing their work, patients receiving care, life unfolding in quiet, constant motion. She paused briefly near the window at the end of the corridor, looking out at the city beyond. Cars moved along the street. People passed by without knowing what had happened inside these walls. And that was the point. Most people would never see moments like that. They would never know how close things came to going wrong, or how much it took to bring them back. Naomi turned away from the window, her expression unchanged, her steps steady as she walked forward again. There was no need to revisit what had already been revealed. The lesson had already been written, not in words, in consequence. And somewhere else in the city, a man who once believed authority gave him the right to decide who belonged was now learning something far more difficult. That respect could not be demanded. That judgment without understanding carried a cost. And that sometimes the moment you think you are in control is the moment everything begins to shift. Naomi continued down the hallway, her presence quiet but undeniable, her purpose clear. She had not raised her voice. She had not fought for power. She had simply stood in truth until the world around her had no choice but to see it. And in the end, that was what changed everything. Because he thought he was the one who decided who belonged. But that day, belonging was not defined by a badge. It was revealed by truth.